Picture this. Havana, July 1994. You are standing at the edge of a vacant lot in the Alamar district. In the eastern part of the city, the lot was a construction staging area. Concrete rubble, weeds, scattered gravel. Nothing has been built here for 3 years because there are no materials and no fuel to move them. The man beside you is Miguel Salquines. He is not a farmer. He trained as an agronomist but spent his career in the bureaucracy. He has an idea for this rubble. It will change his city's food supply, his own income, and eventually the social hierarchy of an entire nation. He does not know any of this yet. He is looking at rubble and thinking about tomatoes. This isn't reconstruction. This is the documented record. When official food systems collapse, what replaces them is never neutral. Leningrad, November 1941. Within 4 weeks of the German encirclement, an illegal trade network had formed inside the city. Bread was the currency. Those who controlled access to the bakeries controlled the blocks around them. Berlin, summer 1945. Within 6 weeks of Germany's unconditional surrender, a cigarette economy had displaced the Reichsmark as the operating currency for approximately 80% of retail transactions in the western sectors. The men who moved Lucky Strikes were the men who moved power. Beirut, October 2019. Within 72 hours of the banking system freezing deposits, informal lending networks tied to established family clans had taken over short-term credit functions. Same mechanism every time. When the official system dies, a new one forms immediately. And whoever builds the new one controls the population it feeds. Here's the question that actually matters. Cuba in the 1990s is celebrated as a story of community resilience. Ordinary Cubans growing food, building cooperatives, surviving without the inputs the Soviet Union had provided. The official story is almost entirely correct. It just leaves out the part about what that survival created. A new economic class, with higher incomes than doctors, access to hard currency, and structural power over the food supply of the country's largest city. The question is not whether the organoponico system worked. The question is who controlled it, who extracted the premium from it, and what the state did when that new class became too powerful to ignore. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how Cuba's food crisis created a new economic hierarchy, who built the distribution network, how they captured the price premium, what Acopio's structural failure meant for who ate and who didn't, and what it reveals about how power actually moves when an official food system collapses. I went through the University of Florida's IFAS Cuban Agriculture Series, the Food First Development Reports, Carmen Diana Deer's documented field research on Cuban cooperative households, and the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy's proceedings. Not theory, documented history. Stick with me. Before we go into the specific case, I want to give you the analytical lens, because this is not a unique story. It is a documented pattern. And once you can see the 4 components, you can read any siege economy in history. Component 1 is the commodity. In every siege economy, something replaces the official currency or official supply chain. The commodity that replaces it is never chosen by policy. It emerges from what the population actually needs and what is actually scarce. The people who control that commodity, not necessarily the people who produce it, control the distribution of survival itself. Component 2 is the network. When legal structures collapse, the network that replaces them runs on trust, geography, and prior relationships. The people who build the new distribution network have 2 things in common. They were already embedded in the relevant supply chain before the collapse, and they were willing to operate outside official channels. These are not always the same people the state would choose. They are often the people the state would have preferred to suppress. Component 3 is the price mechanism. In a siege economy, prices are not set by the market in the way economists describe. They are set by whoever controls information about supply, whoever controls access to the physical goods, and whoever controls the formal legal gateway through which the goods must eventually pass. In Cuba's case, that gateway had a name: Acopio, the state procurement agency. Understanding Acopio is not a footnote to the story. It is the story. Component 4 is the exit. Every new power structure created by a crisis eventually encounters the returning authority. What the state does when the crisis abates reveals its actual relationship to the power it created. In Cuba's case, the exit tells you more about how the food system worked than the crisis itself. Now the case. Here's what the official record shows. Cuba enters the special period in September 1990. The Soviet Union is dissolving. The subsidies stop. The oil stops. Cuba loses 80% of its imports inside 18 months. The state responds with rationing through the Libreta system, the ration book, and eventually with agricultural reforms. In 1993, Law Decree 142 converts 60% of state farmland into basic units of cooperative production, the UBPCs. In September 1994, Council of Ministers Decree 191 legalizes the agricultural markets, the mercados agropecuarios. Food crisis becomes food reform. That is the official story. Here's what the forensic record actually shows. The official food procurement system, Acopio, was not a market. It was a monopoly. Established in 1962, Acopio required all Cuban farmers to sell their production through a single state purchasing agency at state-fixed prices. By the 1980s, economists at Cuba's own Instituto Nacional de Investigaciones Económicas had documented in writing that Acopio prices were systematically below the cost of production. The agency's trucks failed to arrive on time. Crops sat in fields rotting while Acopio vehicles were assigned to other tasks. Carmen Diana Deere, whose fieldwork in Cuban cooperatives is the primary academic record of this period, documented interviews with cooperative managers describing a system where the probability of an Acopio cashier and an Acopio truck appearing at the same collection point simultaneously was, in the words of one official she interviewed, highly unlikely. Here's the brutal math. Before the free farmers markets were briefly legalized in 1980, Acopio prices were so low relative to black market prices that cooperative members had a documented preference scale for their production. First, personal and family consumption; second, barter and unofficial trade with neighbors; third, sale on the black market; and finally, as a last resort, Acopio, the state procurement agency that officially purchased all agricultural production, was structurally last in line for the production it was mandated to collect. The UFAS documentation from the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences states it without ambiguity. Farmers hid storable crops from Acopio collectors, reporting below actual yields to protect reserves for family consumption, barter, and unofficial sale. The state knew this. It permitted it because the alternative, enforcing full compliance, would have eliminated the private production incentive that kept Acopio supplied at all. Same network, same pressure point, same result. Here's the part that changes the entire picture. The free farmers markets were briefly legalized in 1980. They worked immediately. Private production increased. Farmer income rose. The markets reduced black market prices and improved food availability in Cuban cities. And then, in 1986, Fidel Castro closed them. The official reason was inequality, the emergence of a class of farmers with incomes substantially above the national average, some earning more than doctors and engineers. Castro's documented characterization, delivered in 1986, was that the markets had produced corrupt intermediaries and speculation. The markets closed. Acopio reasserted its monopoly, and within 4 years, Cuban agriculture was in the worst crisis in its history, not because of the Soviet collapse that came later, but because the private production incentive had been removed. Cuba's own economists documented the productivity collapse in internal reports before the Soviet subsidies ended. When the Soviet system fell, what fell on top of an agricultural sector that had already been structurally damaged? Here's what the forensic record says about the 1994 reopening. The Malacanezo riots of August 5, 1994, were the trigger. Thousands of Cubans protested in Havana. The protests were, by the documented assessment of the Journal of Democracy, the closest the Cuban opposition had come to asserting itself decisively since 1959. Raúl Castro personally intervened. Within weeks, the Council of Ministers enacted Decree 191 on September 19, 1994, effective October 1st. The agricultural markets reopened. 254 markets were operating within the first year. By spring 1998, over 300 across the country. approximately 65 in Havana alone. The documented results were immediate and specific. By 1995, the 254 markets had sold over 20,000 metric tons of agricultural products valued at 1,716 million Cuban pesos. Those markets generated 75 million pesos in rent revenue for the national budget and 134 million pesos in seller taxes, documented by the Cuban National Statistical Office. The official system had reformed itself into a tax collector of the private system it had previously suppressed. Now, Miguel Celsinés and the Vivero Alamar. Here's what the forensic record doesn't show in the standard account. Vivero Alamar was not a grassroots spontaneous creation. It was formally constituted as a UBPC, a basic unit of cooperative production. In January 1997, it started with 5 members on less than 4 hectares of former construction staging ground in Habana del Este, the eastern district of Havana. Miguel Celsinés, the founder, was a trained agronomist, not an accountant, not a retired teacher, not a random neighbor who discovered gardening, an agronomist with institutional connections to Cuba's research infrastructure. Within 5 years, the cooperative had grown to over 50 members on what had become, through multiple land grants, approximately 11 hectares. PBS NewsHour documented Celsinés describing the farm as feeding 80,000 residents in the surrounding community. Here's where it gets counterintuitive. The workers at Vivero Alamar were not primarily farmers by background. The UBPC Wikipedia documentation is specific on this point. Many of the workers at Alamar had middle-class professional backgrounds: doctors, technicians, bureaucrats who had lost access to their previous employment after the Soviet collapse eliminated the state enterprises and institutions that had employed them. A doctor at a state hospital in 1993 was earning less than 500 pesos per month. A cooperative member at a productive UBPC, documented in 1994 field research by the ASCE's Cuban Agricultural Studies, was earning 608 pesos per month, with some members earning double that. After years of being told that farming was demeaning work, Cuba's professional class was moving into agriculture because agriculture was where the money was. Food First report from this period states it plainly. Access to the open agricultural markets allowed cooperative members to rise to the top of Cuba's social pyramid, sometimes earning double what professionals made. A state that had closed markets in 1986 specifically to prevent farmers from earning more than doctors had, by 1997, created a food system in which former doctors were choosing to become farmers because farming paid more. Same mechanism, same stages, same outcome. Here's the brutal math on the power structure. The UBPC system required cooperatives to sell 70% of their primary production to Acopio at state-fixed prices. The remaining 30%, the surplus, could be sold at the agricultural markets at freely negotiated prices. The market prices were not, in any practical sense, free. They were shaped by whoever controlled access to information about supply, and whoever controlled the physical location of the markets themselves. The UFIS documentation on Acopio from this period describes what amounts to a structural subsidy extracted from farmers, state-mandated prices that did not cover production costs for 70% of output, subsidized by the premium the farmer could capture on the remaining 30% if he had the connections, the transport, and the market access to sell it. The farmers who understood this structure earliest and built their distribution networks first captured the largest premium. Those were not randomly distributed. They were concentrated in cooperatives with institutional connections, research institute affiliations, Ministry of Agriculture relationships, access to the biological inputs that organic farming required and that were controlled in allocation by the same state research apparatus. Nelson Campagnoni, coordinating the National Urban Agriculture Program through INIFAT, the Institute of Fundamental Research in Tropical Agriculture, was simultaneously the institutional gatekeeper for the knowledge infrastructure that made organic farming viable and one of the primary advocates for the policy frameworks that protected the organoponic ecosystem from the state's tendency to reassert monopoly control. The line between technical advisor, institutional advocate, and market participant was, in the documented record, vanishingly thin. Here's what the official record doesn't show on the exit. The 1986 closure of the free farmers' markets was a preview. Castro explicitly cited the creation of a wealthy farmer class as a political threat. When the markets reopened in 1994, economists and political scientists studying the Cuban system noted that the same tensions were immediately present. Jeffrey Marshall, in a 1998 study in world development, documented that three specific problems had contributed to the 1986 closure: inequality, the inability to eliminate the black market, and the illegal diversion of state agricultural inputs to private farmers who could sell at market prices. All three problems reappeared almost immediately after 1994. The Wiley online library publication from 2026 on Cuba's black market economy documents the diversion mechanism specifically. Acopio allocated inputs, fertilizer, tools, materials, to farmers under official contracts. Farmers who did not have Acopio contracts but wanted to sell on the free market would pay premiums, documented at 5 times the official price, to obtain diverted inputs. The state, by creating a 2-tier input distribution system in which access to inputs depended on Acopio contracts, had created the structural precondition for the exact corruption it had used as justification to close the markets in 1986. The Cuban state had, within a decade, recreated the mechanism it had destroyed the markets to prevent, and then used those same markets to tax the mechanism it had recreated. That is not incompetence. That is the documented logic of a state that needs the private food system to function and needs to control the private food system at the same time. The solution is not to choose, it is to oscillate, liberalize when the official system fails catastrophically, tighten when the private system becomes powerful enough to challenge official authority, wait for the next crisis, and repeat. The pattern extracted from Cuba's special period siege economy runs across every case in this pillar. Component 1. The commodity. In Havana in the 1990s, the commodity was not food exactly. It was the input scarcity premium, the price difference between what Acopio paid and what the market would bear. Whoever controlled access to that premium controlled the food supply. Component 2. The network. The network was built by people with prior institutional access, agronomists, research institute affiliates, ministry connections, not by spontaneous community action. The community action was real, but the people who converted community action into institutional durability had pre-existing ties to the apparatus that controlled land allocation and input distribution. Component 3. The price mechanism. Acopio's monopoly on the lower tier created the conditions for the premium on the upper tier. The price premium did not emerge despite state control. It emerged because of it. Without a mandatory low-price tier, there would be no premium to capture on the surplus. Component 4. The exit. The state's documented response to private agricultural success in 1986, in the counter-reform of 2015 through 2019, that reimposed price caps when private farming became excessively successful, confirms that the oscillation is structural. The liberalization is genuine. The tightening is also genuine. The timing of each is determined by which threat is more acute: food shortage or loss of political control over the food supply. The parallel cases confirm the pattern. Berlin, 1945. The cigarette economy that replaced the Reichsmark in Western sector retail transactions was dismantled not when the Reichsmark stabilized, but when the Deutsche Mark was introduced in June 1948 and Western authorities gained a monetary instrument strong enough to compete with the black market. The men who would run the cigarette networks were not arrested in large numbers. They were given licenses in the new retail economy. Same exit structure. Tolerate the informal system until a formal instrument of sufficient strength exists to replace it. Then co-opt rather than prosecute. Leningrad's black market food networks persisted through the entire 900-day siege, not because the Soviet state approved of them, but because eliminating them would have accelerated the civilian deaths the state was trying to prevent. The NKVD arrested individual operators. The networks reconstituted within weeks. The question I'll leave you with is this. When the official distribution system for any essential commodity, food, energy, credit, medicine, fails in a modern economy, the informal network that replaces it will be built by the people who already had access to the physical and institutional infrastructure, not by the people who need the commodity most urgently. What does that tell you about who controls the next informal network before the next official system fails? Now go understand how the price mechanism in any official procurement system actually works before the premium disappears and the network is already built. Drop A in the comments if you studied how a state food system actually prices agricultural production, not the official rate, the real one. I read every single one. Subscribe to The Money Architect. This channel examines how money, power, and systems have interacted across history, the documented evidence of who built them, who profited from their failure, and what they reveal about how power actually moves. Tell me which case you want examined next. I read every single one.